Yes. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As you realize, the situation in Central and Eastern Europe right now is quite hot. So the Research Institute for European America Studies, based in Athens, Greece, with collaboration with the Embassy of Poland and the Embassy of Lithuania, located in Athens, Greece, decided to have, this webinar 2 months ago. We do believe that this webinar comes at the right time, and we are quite happy here in Greece to have experts from Poland, especially the ambassador and the other academician, and experts from Lithuania, because we need people who live in the region and face, the issues on the front line to discuss and inform us and update us on what's going on right now in Central and Eastern Europe, and more or less on the issues that we see every day related to the Ukrainian and the Russian, conflict. I want to thank the ambassador and all the staff in Greece, in Poland, and especially, also the Embassy of Lithuania and the staff there, even though that Lithuanian ambassador has already left to Greece. But anyway, I want to thank all of the staff and the willingness of the embassies in Poland and Lithuania to collaborate with the RIEAS and to inform us and update us. Without any other delay, I would like to pass, the floor to Ambassador of Poland in Athens, Mr. Arthur Lopart, to give a greeting. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor. Dear Professor, dear ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me express my gratitude to Professor Nomikos for the idea and the organization of that webinar. I'm very grateful also to our speakers and participants. Unfortunately, one of the speakers couldn't attend this meeting. I hope that our discussion will be an excellent opportunity to see NATO situation nowadays. When we discussed about the idea of that webinar some months ago with Professor, the situation on the eastern flank of the NATO was quite different. Today, we face the war, the aggression of Russia against its neighbor. And we have heard a new Mr. Lavrov's doctrine that, let me cite it from RIEAS 24. A country whose government doesn't represent the entire nation doesn't deserve sovereignty. It is a very dangerous doctrine which may impact in the future countries in our part of Europe. NATO remains united, solid, and capable of fulfilling its core tasks and defending our home. The 4 multinational battalions stationed in Poland and in Baltic states as part of the NATO enhanced forward presence are the centerpiece of NATO's focus on collective defense in our region. But today, in parallel to traditional military threats, NATO members are confronted by disinformation, cyber attacks, exploitation of energy dependencies, and other asymmetric threats of increasing complexity. Hybrid attacks are relatively low cost, which leads to their proliferation. Hybrid campaigns target our alliance, our societies, and our democratic political systems. They are used as a substitute for an open war, but also precede or accompany military actions, as we can see it in Belarus and Ukraine. Russia continues to be identified by NATO as the main actor targeting NATO countries with hybrid attacks. Since 2021, the hybrid tactics are applied on a full scale, also by Belarus. The key challenge that we continue to respond to in Poland is the instrumentalization of migration, people smuggling orchestrated by Belarusian authorities. an unprecedented hybrid attack on the NATO border, which started last year. Weaponized migration was used to blackmail governments and polarize societies while putting vulnerable people at risk. Manipulated and false messages fabricated by Belarus aimed at discrediting our efforts to protect borders. Thanks to our common, the EU and the NATO efforts to secure the border and international support, including action undertaken by the countries of origin to protect their citizens, the situation at the border improved since major assault in November last year, and the number of attempts dropped. Unfortunately, the state-sponsored hybrid operation is not over. Now, at the time of Russian aggression against Ukraine, it will be strengthened. Addressing hybrid threats requires an effective international cooperation. It is vital to respond collectively and to stand in solidarity with affected allies. We as NATO needs to continue to support the resilience against hybrid threats of our eastern partners, such as Ukraine and Georgia. NATO proved on many occasions that it is up to the task. In other case, Mr. Putin's plans, based on Mr. Alexander Dugin's ideas, I mean, return to the concert of superpowers, disturbing and finally destroying the West, and replacing it by the new savior, Mother Russia, will prevail. Thank you very much, and thank you for everybody to come and listen to this webinar. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your greeting and the analysis of what's going on in the region. And now, without delay, I would like to give the floor to ex-naval officer, Mr. Dimitrios Grims, who is a very well-known experience at NATO operation, to discuss about, response to the challenges threatening the eastern flank of NATO, the United States military perspective. Mr. Dimitris Grimis, the floor is yours. You have 20 minutes maximum.
Okay, well, I'll make sure that we make up any lost time. I'm not a professional politician, so I don't go over. So, Mr. Ambassador, professors, and distinguished attendees, thank you for the opportunity to speak and join this distinguished group today. The content that I'm going to be discussing is unclassified, and I'm speaking as a former naval officer, naval commander. I was a naval aviator and completed 7 deployments, more than 100 combat missions, 2 tours to Afghanistan. And I was a former diplomat as naval attaché to Israel and to Greece, and commander of the U.S. base in Crete. And my last assignment in London, I was a senior advisor to NATO's maritime commander, and I was his NATO Russia and Ukraine and North Africa and Middle East expert. So I have a little bit of familiarity. I've been to a lot of the places that we're reading about today and hearing about. So what I wanted to talk on today is I'm gonna actually cover 3 aspects of this. The first is, the new normal of hybrid warfare, that we've entered a new era, in essence, of hybrid warfare. And then also I'll touch on the authoritarian advantage that exists in that warfare area, and then talk a little bit about what can be done to counter this authoritarian advantage. So, as we know, hybrid warfare is not really a new concept, but the arsenal of options that are being employed in hybrid warfare have significantly expanded to the point where individuals can actually be targeted and influenced to achieve the desired effects. And so from my first combat operations, flying in the Middle East, we were dropping flyers to the Iraqi troops. On one side, it was Iraqi money. On the other side, it was messages to encourage them to drop their weapons and so to speak, we've evolved now to where, you know, the Russians are sending individual text messages to soldiers and units and unit commanders, and to include to citizens, you know, to discourage. So we're using the traditional. I'm also a former Amazon guy too, so we're using the traditional marketing techniques and micro targeting techniques in a sinister way to achieve our objectives on the battlefield without actually having to get on the battlefield. Whereas in the past, you know, the hybrid warfare concepts, psychological warfare, and other operations other than war were something that that accented the actual kinetic operations. And now what we're seeing is the kinetic operation is actually the final act, and it's the accent that closes the deal, if that makes any sense. So what's happening is the broad understanding of our lessons learned and the consequences of past wars has rendered direct and open conflict between nation states is no longer worth the cost, right? And what we're seeing now in the response to Russian aggression in Ukraine is that there's a tremendous lack of desire for the types of great power conflicts that have defined the first half of the 20th century. And we've gone through a period of decades where we actually haven't seen combat between nation states, like traditional combat with heavy machine, you know, with military weapons being employed. We've seen non-state actors or surrogates in the form of terrorism. And as shocking as that has been, like, the society's become numb to it. And we haven't seen a situation where we're going to deal with mass casualties of a nation state sinking another nation state's ship or taking out a whole tank battalion. And we're about to see that, right? So, you know, and one of the things that has made that possible, you know, the global economy and the economic interdependence and the potential use of nuclear and biological weapons and the lack of will from the general public have created the ideal conditions for nations to conduct these operations other than war in order to achieve their desired objectives. So given these conditions, while nations do not wish to go directly to war, the battle space, as I said before, the battle space has expanded to encompass all these new technologies and domains, right? And it's not just it's not just the technologies and the domains. We're seeing in the case of China and even Russia, they've integrated themselves into being a necessary part of the economy and the day-to-day lives of the people that they are the adversaries towards, right? So 40% of the NATO and EU's energy needs come from Russia. Look at the global supply chain for medical devices, everything from consumer electronics to medical devices, our dependence upon China, right? And so we've actually for decades have put ourselves into a position to where our adversaries basically can own us, and I'll touch on that when I get into the authoritarian advantage. But you know, just to make sure, you know, I know you mentioned you had some students in here, and I wanted to make sure that we understand how NATO defines hybrid war. Okay, so NATO defines hybrid threats as combining military and non-military, as well as covert and overt means, including disinformation, cyber attacks, economic pressure, and deployment of irregular armed groups and use of regular forces. And so I'm sure there are quite a few history buffs here and readers of Sun Tzu and Machiavelli and others. And so Sun Tzu, and I'm applying some of this to my political campaign, but you know, Sun Tzu famously said, in the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting, right? And so sanctions, cyber attacks, assassinations, armed drone operations, espionage, political games, they've all become the common method that we're seeing being employed. And I don't know if this would be a whole topic of its own, but if you want to really get some insights into how this new era of warfare is going to play out, you know, General Valery Gerasimov, who's Russia's chief of the general staff, in February of 2013, wrote an article which has become known as the Gerasimov doctrine. And I highly encourage you to take a look at it. It's just a 2,000-word essay titled "The Value of Science in the Foresight." And in this, he talks about the tactics developed by the Soviets, blended them with strategic military thinking about total war, and he laid out a new theory of modern warfare, one that looks more like hacking an enemy society than attacking it head on to achieve the desired effect, and subdue the enemy without a fight, right? So, you know, one of the things he wrote, I'll quote him, he said, "The very rules of war have changed. The role of non-military means of achieving political and strategic goals has grown. In many cases, they have exceeded the power of force of weapons in their effectiveness. All this is supplemented by the military means of a concealed character." And so the article is considered basically Russia's new doctrine, and it's the vision of total warfare that places politics and war within the same spectrum of activities, both philosophically and logistically. So, the approach is guerrilla, and it's waged on all fronts with the full range of actors and tools. And for example, they're right now they have an army of hackers, they have media misinformation, the business. I mean, when you think about it, I mean, you can characterize Russia. Russia is basically the most heavily armed. I know we have some Russians in here, but I'm giving you the American perspective, but and maybe some others' perspective, but Russia is really the most heavily armed nuclear capable crime syndicate that exists, right? And so when we talk about us being representative democracies, how can Vladimir Putin and some of these other authoritarian leaders want to be placed at the same level when we sit across the table from each other? But when we're sitting across the table from these people, when our leaders are sitting across the table, we can't honestly say that these people actually represent their people. They weren't elected, right? I mean, they weren't elected. So that's why I say that that's why I characterize these guys as authoritarian, the authoritarians that they are. So now, thanks to the internet and social media, the kinds of operations that the Soviet, the former Soviet, the Russian psychological teams are using are upending the domestic affairs in our free societies. So they're actually using, they're using our open societies and our free market system and our freedom of speech and the elements that make us a representative societies. They're using those to their advantage, and I'll touch a little bit more on that when I get into the authoritarian advantage. So basically, the Gerasimov doctrine builds on the framework that these new tools and declares that non-military tactics are not auxiliary to the use of force, but the preferred way to win, right? And so everyone's talking about, well, Putin has been building up his forces since March, right? And what have the Western leaders done, right? What has been done? What have the leaders of our representative democracies done to counter that? But I say he didn't begin this operation in March when he positioned 90,000 troops on the border surrounding Ukraine. He did this going back to 2014 when he went into Crimea. And what has been done since, right? I mean, the United States of America imports 200,000 barrels of oil a day from Russia. So, you know, how can we say that we're serious about the consequences, you know, that are gonna, that Putin and his people are gonna suffer when we're taking 200,000 barrels of his oil per day, and that Europe takes 40% of their energy needs, and that the president of the United States said that Nord Stream 2 is off the table for sanctions, and that 20 out of 30 NATO countries for the past several decades have refused to honor their commitments and maintain their force level readiness and training, you know, to the 2% NATO mandate. You know, so, you know, that goes off into a whole nother discussion. But then you add to that, you know, in the US, I don't know how it's been playing out in the European media, but for the last week, we've had the Secretary of State, we've had the Secretary of Defense, the President, the Vice President say that Russia's going to suffer consequences if they go into Ukraine. But not a single journalist stuck a microphone back in the face and asked these questions. Well, what do you mean they're going to suffer consequences? What have you done? We've known this. This has been a slow motion invasion that's been documented, right? And so you add to that, you know, the U.S. issued a non-paper a few weeks ago declaring that that we don't support the Eastern Mediterranean oil and gas pipeline, which back when I was a diplomat, we were trying to promote the idea of energy diversity to get Europe off of Russian oil and gas. You know, foreseeing this taking place in the future, and the current administration basically said we don't support that effort. And you know, that effort was also driving diplomacy between Israel and Middle Eastern partners that nobody ever envisioned Israel getting along with in order to finance the project, right? So that's one of the disadvantages that we have. So anyway, going back to in the case of Ukraine, Russia has been, you know, deploying the Gerasimov doctrine for the past several years, like I said, and during the 2014 protests there, the Kremlin supported extremists in the fight, and pro-Russian forces and Ukrainian ultra-nationalists were fueling the conflict, and they used the pretext to seize Crimea and launch the war into Eastern Ukraine. And one of the things that nobody's even talking about is, I mean, this is my personal opinion, is from my understanding, you know, because I've been on the ground. I don't know if other people have been on the ground up there. I actually helped the Ukrainians rewrite their whole maritime doctrine based on what was left of their Navy after 2014. And one of the big concerns was that, especially the Ukrainian military professionals highlighted, was that Putin is not done, and that he needs the Mykolaiv shipyards, which are to the west of Crimea, because he needs to rebuild his fleet, and that's the only shipbuilding capacity that he has. He doesn't, and he's a smart man. He doesn't want to be dependent on buying Chinese ships. So he has no shipbuilding capacity. He needs the MiG jet engine factories that are in, and so really, I think that his aim was to make it look like he was going to take all of Ukraine with the intent of negotiating down to taking the Mykolaiv shipyards and the industrial areas, but he's realized that there's no will, and that he could actually get more than what he wants. I mean, that's my personal assessment. So going back into going back into this idea that, you know, the real power of the Gerasimov of what we're witnessing right now is that the shadow wars are effective because it's hard to muster a resistance to an enemy that you can't see, right? So in all of this hybrid warfare and information, misinformation, ops, and use of proxies, there's plausible deniability because you can't tie, even though everyone knows that the source, where the source is coming from, there's plausible deniability, and it's very difficult to counter, right? It's not an all-powerful approach, but the shadowy puppeteering at the heart of this Gerasimov doctrine makes it extremely effective. And it's, you know, so we're going to see, I think this is the new normal that we're going to be seeing, you know, and you know, unconventional methods have become part of this multi-domain warfighting approach, and the use of these means to disrupt and destabilize an opponent's actions without engaging in open hostilities is going to be more broadly employed, and it's being used daily, you know. So I'm going to roll in order to stick to the time, because we can go off and talk for a long time on all of this, and I mean, again, the scheduling of this webinar is very timely. And so, you know, going into the authoritarian advantage, which I touched on earlier, is, you know, in the 21st century, we've entered this new era of emboldened authoritarian ambition, right? We had a period that was going up where the number of authoritarian regimes were declining, right? And I think, and now they're back on the rise. And what we're seeing is, and even in some cases where, like, for example, in our own hemisphere, in the United States, in the Western hemisphere, we have countries like Nicaragua and Venezuela and Honduras and now Chile, which are toying, that are semi-authoritarian, becoming authoritarian. Even within NATO, I don't know if we have any Turks in here, but even within NATO, we have our own rogue ally with an elected leader who, over the course of time, has changed the rules and changed laws in order to secure his power. And so that's a whole nother discussion there. But as I was saying, in the 21st century, we've entered this new era of emboldened authoritarian ambition, and representative democracies, which are beholden to transparency and political and bureaucratic inefficiency and delayed responsiveness, political whims and divisiveness. In many cases, term limits are actually at a disadvantage, right? Because we can't engage in the long-term defense planning and strategy mindset that's required to counter this ever-growing current and threat that impacts us both currently and in the future, you know, due to the innovations that are being employed in hybrid warfare. So the other thing that we're seeing is unprecedented cooperation and collaboration between the authoritarian regimes around the world to undermine representative democracies, right? Because they know that information is power, and they are working really hard to control that information and to discredit democracies as inefficient and divisive, and they've been very effective in many cases at making people question the merit of their institutions, the integrity of their elections, and others. Even in Afghanistan, in my second tour, I was a judge in the trials of Al Qaeda and Taliban, and I was also a prosecutor of these enemy combatants that we had captured. And I even had one of my prisoners who started lecturing me, and he was a fundraiser for the cause, and he was highlighting some interesting talking points, and he said that, we have our own system here, which we consider transparent, and it's arrogant of you, who claim to be uh, uh, to respect representative governance when what you call what you call corruption here, we call corruption in your case political contributions and subcontracting, right? And they said, we ask, who paid the people to vote the way they voted, and who paid the people to count the votes the way they wanted them to be counted, right? And so that's the authoritarians are basically turning it around and saying, hey, look, your system isn't, because they understand that there are more people right now in this world that have mobile devices and access to the internet than actually have shoes, and they are consuming information, and they are struggling to make sure that they can stay ahead of that. And the way they can stay ahead of it is to make people question the information that they're seeing, and trust only the information that's coming from them. And so, going into my final portion, so countering the authoritarian advantage. So what can we do? Well, we are representative democracies, right? We don't, and we have to operate within the constraints that we have, but we're not being aggressive enough. And I think that this is where each country has its own specifics, but we need to make sure, and what I tell people on the campaign trail is that we have to, the most important title in a representative democracy is citizen, right? And that every citizen has an obligation to ensure that the people who they are elected are there to represent them and to serve them. And that's the big struggle and the big challenge that we face in our representative democracies. And we have to we have to be more in the case of NATO and our military operations and our information operations, we have to continue to maintain the high ground because our cause is righteous, and as it's challenging to get the consensus that you need to do things that need to be done, but it's going to take bold leadership and in order to get back on track. And we have to, our response right now, from Putin is basically setting a precedent that we're going to be dealing with for the next century if we don't get our act together and unite behind, supporting people's right to self-determination. And it doesn't mean that, that an American needs to go over there and shed blood, but we have to be firm, and we have not been firm in saying that, telling Putin that no, we're not going to let you do this, right? We're not employing all of the tools that we have in our diplomatic arsenal, right? I mean, if we said, hey, we're going to sanction Russian oil and we're going to treat Russia as if it's a drug cartel, and we're going to seize Russian assets. We're going to revoke all Russian airlines and air transport operations, IATA clearance. We're going to basically ostracize Russia, because right now, one of the things I learned in Israel is they're masters at quantifying the impact of things, right? And they used to tell our leaders when I accompanied them into their meetings, I said, the best thing that America can do for the world is to drive the price of energy down, because our guys would look around with a little question on their face and said, because every dollar the price of oil goes up per barrel means that Putin is making an extra $10 million per day. The Iranians are making an extra $2 million per day, and the Venezuelans are making an extra $1 million per day. And so now with the prospect of oil and gas prices rising by $20 a barrel, Putin is going to be making $200 million extra per day to help finance his operation. The Iranians are going to make an extra 80 million per day, and the Venezuelans are sitting back making an extra 20 million per day. So these are some of the things that we need to have, that I wish that our leaders were having, because I've been in the rooms and I know that they're not having those conversations. So anyway, that's one of the things that's driving me to run for office, and you can learn more about me if you Google grimesflorida.com. Go to grimesflorida.com, and you'll hear more about my effort there. But thank you for having me, and I hope I yield the remainder of my time to the other distinguished guests.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dimitris Grims, for the outstanding analysis, and thank you very much for letting us know that you are running for a congressional seat, in the coming months. But since you are on the other part of the Atlantic, I would like, to spend the 10 minutes to give to the floor, to the participant to ask you, but please, your question to be as short as possible, to the point. Yes. And please don't make long comments. If you want to make a comment, please, it has to be short, because we have only 10 minutes question for Mr. Dimitris Grims, because he has to run, for some other obligation he has. So if someone wants to ask, possibly Mr. Glynn, Dr. Glynn Seeger from Israel would like to make a question. Dr. Glenn.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, I can hear you.
That's great. It's just a very short question, because we know that Putin's health has deteriorated. And what we are really wanting to know is what is next. He's going to go for Ukraine, which will now border with Syria. Is he looking to move further westwards? Is he looking to move further southwards and even take Syria, for example, and get a port on the Mediterranean Sea, which he already has control of? But if he actually has Syrian territory, he will become a Mediterranean actor. And given Putin's health, could we actually say at this stage that he's making rational decisions? To what extent is the decision-making taking place right now in the Kremlin anything we can say is sane? He appears to me to be sort of like a Gaddafi-type figure at the moment. I'll leave the question at that. Thank you.
Well, one of the advantages, and one of the advantages he has this authoritarian advantage, right? He is the supreme leader. He doesn't have to get consensus to do what he needs to do. He can and we're seeing he's directing the full power of the state, the military, the institutions, to include, the business entities that have the connections and the ties where he needs to conduct his operations. And I think that he's going to be, if he pulls off this taking the whole state of all of Ukraine without any consequence, he's going to continue to nibble. And he knows, he reads the same open source that we read. He knows that in a recent poll in Germany, 87% of Germans said that they don't believe that they should have to go defend another NATO country. 76% of Italians said that they don't. So there's this, he has the advantage, and I could see him, that's one of the reasons he's exhibited some extreme loyalty to people like Assad and the other dictators, authoritarians that are around the region. And he's gonna, I could see him making a play down there at some point. I think what he wants to do is he needs to lock in the eastern part of the west of Crimea for those industrial, the shipyards. And also that's where a lot of people, they don't even talk about the fact that in 2014, he seized the Ukrainian oil wells and oil industry, and he's been selling that stolen oil and gas to the Europeans without consequence, so. I can't hear you.
Sir,
Hello?
yes, welcome, sir. Could you identify what country you are from?
I am Onur Katmerci.
Okay,
I'm from Turkey.
all
I'm
right,
consul.
sir. Okay, please, the floor is yours.
Also, I served in Afghanistan from 2008 to 10. And also I worked at the NATO HQ recently, and this is my next post in Athens.
Yes.
So I've been into the allied environment quite some time.
Yes.
So it's quite disappointing to hear that we sometimes allude to define ourselves, each other, like authoritarian regimes or this and that. I don't want to go into the details. Since we are allies, I believe that we have to tackle all problems together in a unified manner with solidarity. And also, I want to make one short remark about the human mobility. Human mobility resulting from instabilities and conflicts, you know, from source countries have indeed became a major issue. And it sometimes triggers transnational crime, and it includes including also migrant smuggling. And migration and asylum is an integral and inevitable phenomenon that has continued, and it will continue to exist. And we believe it's not realistic to define asylum flows as hybrid threats, you know, by disregarding international obligations and attempt to stop migration completely. Our belief is that our aim should be to manage migratory flow instead of calling them as hybrid threats. So thank you very much for the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Onur. Before I go to the next participant, I would like Mr. Grimes to, I have two questions, just to read it to you. Question to Mr. Grimm. Does the USA have a hybrid war capacities at the same level of Russia? How is it used in the current conflict? Question number one. Question number two is, can you explain why the USA does not support the oil stream in the East Mediterranean? Mr. Grimm, these two questions shortly for you.
Yeah, well, you know, we definitely have, we have incredible capacity. I mean, as a former Amazon guy, I can tell you some things that will blow your mind of some capacities that we have. But the thing that prevents us from employing that is a thing called ethics, which doesn't exist on the other side. So, you know, and then what was the second part of the question?
The second one is, can you explain why the United States does not support the oil stream in the East Mediterranean?
Yes, and unfortunately, it's strictly, it's because of this current administration and the Democratic Party's assault on the U.S. oil and gas industry, as well as our allied oil and gas industry, because it's a political thing in which we have vilified the oil and gas industry, and there's actually it doesn't make any sense, because the foundation of a strong economy requires a reliable, secure, and cheap source of energy. And again, we're being subject to some of this hybrid warfare, misinformation in demonizing our oil and gas industry in order for us to relinquish that energy independence, because that is the sole source of income for some of these other authoritarian regimes like Iran and Russia and Venezuela, right? And this is one of the things we're going to change when we take back the House and the presidency, is we're going to restore American energy independence, because that is another component of the arsenal of democracy. And you know, we need to make sure that we don't find ourselves in a position like Europe, which, I mean, Putin could turn this whole thing around. He could have turned it around a few weeks ago, and I'm sure he made some efforts, you know, behind the scenes, and told the leaders of Germany and other people that, hey, listen, I can cut off your oil and gas, and your European people are going to freeze this winter, and they're going to vote you out of office next fall. You know, so yeah, the West needs energy diversity and energy security. It makes absolutely no sense that our government killed the East Med oil and gas pipeline. And part of it is just the unfortunate effects of the hyper-partisan political fight that we're in. And this current administration is trying to undo everything that the last administration did.
Thank you, Dimitris. And the last question is from a Russian student at the University of Webster in the United States. Marina, Mrs. Marina Artemova, can you make a short question? You're the last one to Mr. Dimitris Grims.
Yes, I will be very quick. First of all, I would like to thank Mr. Dimitris for beautiful speech, for letting us know something new, because we are here to learn, first of all. And I would like to ask a question, as we know that every conflict or any situation, either it's good or bad situation, even any genocide, right? Any historical event has its version, why it took place, right? No matter if we agree with this version or we disagree, they always provide us with something that we're doing this because of that, we're doing this because of that, right? So the version of Russia, right, in this conflict, there are many details, right? One of them is that they don't want NATO troops near their borders, right? That's the thing. So as they say, we're protecting our our people, our security, trying to secure the borders. So do you have the world is against these actions, some support and some very understanding towards these actions. So let's say, what would you suggest for Russia to do in this situation if you were in the Russian position? Because everybody is judging, right? But nobody is suggesting what they would do in this situation if they were in the place of Putin.
Right. Yeah. And I love the Russian people. I've been to Russia. I was actually the first U.S. naval aviator to be sent to Russia to do Russian pilot survival training. And I was actually on a Russian reality show that followed us through our survival training. But what we're dealing with is and I touched on this earlier, there's a big disconnect between the Russian government and the Russian people, right? And so say that where are you in school right now? In Wisconsin?
Me now, no, not now, not.
Oh, no. So say we're next door neighbors. I live in a condominium complex, and I decide NATO, and NATO needs to improve its own public relations, but NATO is a defensive alliance. It's an alliance that it's unlike any other alliance that has been created in history. Throughout history, people had joined alliances to conquer. In the case of NATO, NATO is an alliance of people who joined to defend each other, right? And so that's at the core of NATO, and it's proven through its history that, the NATO expansion wasn't NATO conquering territory. It was free, democratically elected states that chose to join this group, right? So it's like, say you and I are next door neighbors, and I decide that I'm gonna put security cameras and an advanced high-tech burglar alarm system in to make sure nobody breaks into my apartment, right? If you don't plan to break into my apartment, why would you be offended that I'm spending all this money to defend my apartment? And so that's the concept of NATO, right? But, Putin is turning it around because his aim, and you have to understand his intentions, and he's said it in his speeches many times, is the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, and this is quoting him, was the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, right? And so he says this, that was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, you know, over the Holocaust, over World War II, over all these other things. And so, yeah, he has an ambition to restore the empire, right? And he's using the misinformation that NATO it wants to expand and then come in, and that's not the case. And I mean, those are the facts.
Thank you, Dimitris. And now we have a very short question from Mr. Giuseppe Giacobini, who is from the Journalist Association. Please, Mr. Giacobini, unmute, sir. Unmute. Yes, please. This is the last question.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think there is a strong relation from Russia and China. I remember in the 19 years, an important agreement between Russia and China. Putin, in exchange for favoring a large import of China production, built for free a pipeline many kilometers long to bring gas to China. My question is, do you think there is the very, 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 for Putin is the supply of China?
Well, so there's incredible collaboration between Russia and China, and it's not even being reported, you know, that Putin and Xi have weekly meetings and weekly strategy sessions, and they're aligned because they have aims of redrawing the maps of both Europe and Asia, and they see the idea of, they view the idea of representative democracy as a threat to people like themselves, because you know, they don't respect the will of the people, and Russia has what China needs, and China has what Russia needs, right? China produces more steel in one day than the United States of America produces in a year, you know, and so China has the industrial capacity, but they don't have the energy, and Russia has the energy, but they don't have the industrial capacity. But Putin is also smart, and he understands that the Chinese are ultimately going to be his own enemy, and so that's why he has to make a play and secure some of the industrial areas that he's going to need to build the war machine to defend himself in the future and Russia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dimitris Grimm, for having the time to answer all this interesting question. Now we are on time, but we have to move on. And I want to give the floor to Professor Artur Gruchak, that will speak about perspective of Poland and the challenge for the eastern flank of NATO. Professor Artur Gruchak is from Jagiellonia University at the Faculty of International and Political Studies. He's the head of the Department of National Security in Krakow. I personally know him for quite a time. He's one of the best experts in Poland. He focuses a lot about national security issues, European intelligence studies, and so on. So, Artur, allow me to say with your first name, please, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much, John, for this nice welcome. And thank you, Ambassador Lompot, for inviting me to this webinar. Well, actually, it just happened to have it in the very special time. And well, it's really difficult and it's challenging to talk about NATO's challenges in the current years, 2022, just listening to the media or watching TV and reading about what's going on in the close proximity of NATO, moreover in the country which has for years been pretending to to strengthen cooperation and mutual relationship with NATO. Well, I'd like to raise several issues which firstly focus on NATO as an alliance and as a security pact, but also to see the eastern flank as part of NATO, as a part of NATO policy. So let me just point to some aspects of NATO's strategy and policy in a wider terms. Well, first and foremostly, I would start with general observation that, well, having listened to Mr. Grimes' very interesting presentation, I'm not sure whether what we've been witnessing today is still hybrid warfare. It's a full-scale war with some elements of hybrid warfare. Of course, it's really contentious to analyze the situation unfolding in Ukraine, but also in other countries where they are located along the eastern flank, in terms of preparation, in terms of some contingencies, in terms of to see them in terms of response against the elements of hybrid war. Well, unfortunately, and that's really a tragic moment in the history of Europe. Probably it's a sea change in the 21st century of Europe. Russia as a member of the Security Council, Russia as a member of OSCE, Russia as a counterpart for NATO's member states, and also having special, let's say, council for making and upholding cooperation with NATO, launched the full-scale aggression against Ukraine. So unfortunately, this means that what we've been thinking about the global security was a sort of delusion. And I think that NATO has to cope with this feeling and this general conclusion that we are not only witnessing the decay of stability in Europe, probably as I said, sea change in global security, but also we've seen a continuous downsliding of liberal international order. So this means that the time of complacency of the West is over. But the question is how to respond, how to answer to Russia's aggression, and what consequences should it have for NATO. And I'm a bit skeptic, and I'm not really optimistic about the, let's say, closing ranks, about just showing up the unity and to see NATO and the European Union speaking one voice. Of course, in general declarations, we would find the lowest common denominator. We are against aggression, we are against the violation of international law, but how we are going to deter, how are we going to stop Russia's military actions, and how we are going to prevent Russia aggression from spreading over, from hitting NATO member states. Well, to be an alliance, it's a great value, and that was one of the main strategic objectives which had been set by new democratic governments, which had been established just out of this post-Soviet, post-communist disorder And we know well, and that's also the history of my nation, of my country, Poland, that the membership in NATO was absolute priority. It was the strategic objective, and fortunately, it was achieved in 1997, 1999. So the Russia's blackmail against the Western community, against NATO, to roll back this, to return to, let's say, post-Soviet era, is absolutely unacceptable. And the question is how NATO is going to, let's say, to be staunch and to defend the decision which were already taken. And well, we know that NATO as a community of 30 nations is, unified or united in its diversity, but diversity might be a sort of a curse, because, well, NATO has to speak one voice in regard to, or in response to aggression, in response to disinformation, in response to, well, weaponization, instrumentalization, migrants, all these threats and risk that Russia and its allies, especially Belarus, have been generating for months and for years. Well, we know that it's not really easy to work out consensus on NATO level, in the Atlantic Council, or in the European Council, or ministerial councils of the European Union. Well, I don't want to just remind some declarations that were made by leaders of some top nation NATO and EU members. Well, French president said some time ago, NATO is brain dead. Well, it's not, of course, it's not. Nevertheless, this sort of proclamation, of this sort of declaration, is really harmful for NATO as a unified bloc, regardless of French ambitions, regardless of some personal, let's say, motivations. It was not a good step, and moreover, some reverberations of these declarations were showing that NATO is far from the unity. And now we reached a sort of threshold. Now is the time for the test and the time for real trial. How to respond to the situation close to NATO's confines. Well, where we know that NATO has a strategic concept, NATO has contingency plans, NATO is ready for military and non-military operations, but what does it mean in details? And that's a real question mark. That's a real question mark. Of course, I'm not in the NATO. I'm not going to just figure out what NATO, what North Atlantic Council has been actually doing for hours. I can only say that well, NATO has been preparing for a new strategic concept. It's going to be adopted in June 22 in Madrid during the NATO summit. I'm very skeptical about the real content of this strategic concept, if it's going to be adopted in Madrid. Or I'm really curious what's going to be in there, what's going to be its content in response to not only Russia's aggression in Ukraine, most probably Russia's hybrid activities in the Baltic countries, probably in Poland, probably in the Caucasus, because we must be absolutely aware of one simple fact. This operation was not just decided overnight. It was actually being prepared years And of course, well, the 2014 or 2008 in Georgia, 2014 in Ukraine, they were just, tests which the West totally failed. And that was another, let's say, incentive for Putin regime to just upgrade the Russian strategic outlook and to take into consideration the most radical decisions, which we've been witnessing right now. Well, so just to find a sort of excuse for the West, well, you know that the West is, as some said, some observers and analysts said, it's the US and the rest, right? So it's the United States of America as absolute leader of the Western Bloc and the North Atlantic community. And of course, the question is what's going to be decided in the White House, in the Capitol, and how the United States going to respond to this juncture that we've seen recently. Well, it's a real burden for the US, and it's also a kind of curse to take the lead in such a special time, given that, well, actually, the challenge is not only Russia. The next challenger is, of course, China. And we already seen that, well, China is very, I would say, mild in its response to Russia's military operation. And moreover, it looks like economic cooperation between Russia and China is going to accelerate. So it's something what was expected that China will be a sort of safety valve for Russia, regardless of the fact that Russia is prepared for sanctions, and it's well, the reserves are really tremendous. It's estimated that Russia has at least $600 billion as its reserves. So it might survive sanctions being kept for months, if not years. And the question is, of course, is the West ready to survive sanctions against Russia? If they are going to be really, let's say, serious, harmful and effective in terms of changing Russia's policy, or just sort of putting an end to aggression in Ukraine and enforcing withdrawal of Russian forces. For now, I'm not going to be a prophet. I'm afraid it's not a good. There's no good solution to this. But just going back to China, well, we know that one of the biggest strategic decisions taken in the 21st century by the US administration was a pivot to Asia Pacific, right? So now the question is the US ready to repivot its strategy to Europe, or to have some, let's say, two strategic areas, Europe and even not Asia Pacific, the Indo-Pacific region? Well, I'm afraid it's too much for even such a power as the United States. And I'm afraid the Putin administration, his advisors are well aware of that, and they will explore this, let's say, new geostrategic outlook or new situation provoked by Russia's invasion on on Ukraine. Well, this raises another very important question, and it's a question of NATO reliability. And this in NATO face-saving decisions that should be taken as quick as possible. Actually, in the meantime, between one and another meeting, this is a very hot season, I would say, I tried to read a transcript of Secretary General Stoltenberg, his statement, and it's quite balanced, rather say focusing on diplomatic efforts. Of course, some decisions strengthening or reinforcing NATO's presence in the eastern flank should be taken, but actually this is the real challenge and the real task to NATO: how to establish and maintain reliable and firm deterrence on the eastern flank, in military terms, in diplomatic terms, in political terms, in cyber terms. It's a big challenge, but I think that the first NATO's decision that should be taken is to deploy more troops along the eastern flank, especially in the Baltic republics and in Poland. But it's underway. But I wouldn't say that we really returned to the times of the Cold War, when we had a 250,000 US soldiers stationing in Europe, and we had a real, let's say, military structure, command and control, and to operational tactical units under full readiness and command. Maybe this is not necessary, but I think that substantial and effective reinforcement of the eastern flank is the first step that NATO has to take. And the last challenge, or the last remark. Well, NATO, since actually 1999, when this Washington strategy concept was adopted, NATO has expanded its perception of security from military to non-military aspects, including economy, including infrastructure, including climate change, including other, let's say, aspects, non-military or other than war. But still we have to, and NATO, its leaders and its societies has to be fully aware that what's going on in Ukraine now, and what's threatening NATO's member states, especially located in the eastern flank, is war, military aggression, probably unbelievable casualties, damage, suffering, all this what we've been witnessing today in Ukraine. And I think that NATO should be fully aware of one simple thing, that Ukrainian lives matter. Ukrainian lives matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Arthur Krusek. We reserve, the question asking Professor. I would like to go on our Baltic, scholar, Mr. Justina Kulis, who is going to speak about hybrid threats for the Baltic state. And Mr. Justina Kulis is from the Eastern Europe Studies Center in Lithuania, and he's also a project manager and a policy analyst. Mrs. Justina, please take the floor. You have 15 minutes too.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you very much for the invitation and for organizing such an important and timely discussion on the situation on the NATO eastern flank. But I have to admit that it's really difficult days to talk about our security, as it's really being threatened very much. Today is my great honor to represent Lithuania and the Baltic states perspective, and at the same time the leading Lithuanian think tank on international affairs, the Eastern Europe Studies Center. The latest developments in Ukraine and also next in Belarus, in Kaliningrad, it's a really concerning matter to all of the security community in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. At the same time that we are preparing for possible military threats, at the same time we are preparing for possible hybrid threats. And the range of hybrid threats is extensive. Therefore, I will focus my speech on four, in my perspective, vital hybrid threats I see typical for the Baltic states, and sharing Lithuanian experience on how we endure them and how we try to counter them. So first of all, I would like to talk about energy security. I think a very important topic now for all the Europeans. And the energy sector of the Baltic states are still profoundly interconnected with the Russian one to this day, and it causes a certain feeling of insecurity for the Baltic states, as there are some concerns about being a part of the Berlin ring that connects Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Belarus, and Russia electricity network, but someday it might be, disconnected for us. Astravets nuclear power plant is a severe headache for the Baltic states, especially for Lithuania, as it's very close to its capital city, Vilnius. This nuclear power plant poses a direct threat to the Baltic states and Poland's citizens, mainly because it raises a serious security concerns. The Astravets nuclear power plant building was followed by rumors and news about different incidents, including one during which the nuclear reactor's core was damaged. Testing the first block was also followed by information about the massive incidents. Built closely to the Lithuanian border, the Astravets nuclear power plant is being used as a political pressure tool against Lithuania, causing danger to all the neighboring countries and the Belarusian citizens itself. Lithuania encourages the neighboring countries to avoid buying Belarusian electricity, making the power plant unprofitable. The gas sector is also problematic, as the same with most states in Europe that are dependent on the Russian gas. Energy and heating prices rose mainly in both Lithuania and Europe because of Russian manipulation of gas prices. After gaining independence, Lithuania experienced the energy blockade. Then the Soviet Union stopped all the supply of gas and oil products. This created a fundamental mistrust in the dependency from one supplier that was expressed by Lithuanian politicians to its Western allies many times. Current trends in the European gas market proves that Lithuanian suspicions were not an alarmism, as some people called it, but a sincere wish to warn Europe not to pull all eggs in the one bag. Lithuania is still heavily dependent on the Russian gas supply. Still, as an electricity sector, we are moving towards diversifying our gas supply, and one of the critical steps was made in 2014. Independence, delivered in March 2014, is an LNG carrier designed as a floating LNG storage as the regasification unit used as in Lithuanian LNG import terminal. The vessel can store so much natural gas that it can actually supply all the needs of Lithuania, making sure that in the situation of any gas cuts possible by land, we can still import all of the gas we need via sea. Yet the project of an LNG terminal was and still is one of the key targets for disinformational campaigns in Lithuania and abroad. The synchronization with Western and Nordic Europe and desynchronization from Russia and Belarus is one of the key things for Lithuania, one of the strategic goals. And it's not only for Lithuania, but also for Latvia and Estonia too. It's not just an infrastructural project, it's a matter of national security. The same goes for the diversification of natural gas supply. This all would mean that finally gaining independence from Moscow in the energy sector, and it's one of the most important steps and topics currently discussed not only in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, but also in Europe. There are some fears that Russia might cut gas supply for the whole of Europe. The importance of the energy sector for security can be also illustrated by the fact that NATO Energy Security Center of Excellence operates in Vilnius, Lithuania. The second field of hybrid threats for the Baltic states and NATO and EU allies is securing its critical infrastructure. Yet, in this matter, I will not talk about the cyber or physical threats for the infrastructure itself, but I will instead focus on the ownership of it and foreign investments in it, as I think it's also interesting and important topic, not only in Lithuania, but also in the South and Southeast Europe. This topic is becoming increasingly discussed in Lithuania too. The National Commission for the Protection of Objects Important for Ensuring National Security is the central structure to determine whether the investment is not against the national security of Lithuania. I want to share one example on how this commission works. The largest bridge in the Baltic should be built in Jonava, Lithuania, and should be completed by 2024. But this may not happen, because as one of the winners of a construction tender has already been eliminated, and the reliability of the other is still being assessed by the Commission. The Spanish company that came first in the tender for the bridge has been excluded from the tender because 2/3 of its shares had been acquired by China Road and Bridge Corporation, a Chinese company owned by China Communications Construction, a state-owned corporation. This company has been sanctioned by the United States since the last August for its links to the Chinese military structures. The Italian company, which came second in the tender, is also under a magnifying glass. It has regularly received large orders from the Russian state corporations. In 2022, the Italian company announced 2 projects at the Moscow refinery industrial complex owned by Russian oil giant Gazprom Neft, and enjoy a long-standing partnership with the Gazprom group as well. Why all these things being done in Lithuania? The very critical position of Lithuanian state institutions is that all critical infrastructure, both military and civilian, has to be secured against the possible threats for at least 2 main reasons. First, secure detailed technical information about vital infrastructure in Lithuania from possibly hostile foreign actors. And secondly, to secure the Lithuanian economy from the possible economic influence that might be used as a leverage to pressure Lithuania to seek support or stay mute regarding specific policies by the foreign actors that controls that critical infrastructure in Lithuania. First, the third aspect I would like to cover in my presentation shortly, I think it's one of the most important actually nowadays, especially today when we see a lot of information flowing from Ukraine, is the threat of disinformation. Speaking of NATO and disinformation against NATO, I think it's also important when we're speaking about the NATO's Eastern flank. One of the prominent examples of misinformation spread in the Baltic states regarding it is how the Russian media is trying to draw a confrontation between the military and social spending in the Baltic states. One of the most active spreaders of such narratives is a Russian-speaking Baltic states population-focused BaltNews.ru news outlet. In our research and in cooperation with our Slovakian colleagues from GlobSec, we found out that there are a dozen articles focused on Lithuanian military purchase that are focused on 2 critical narratives. First of all, they try to show that Lithuania is just a scrapyard, buying all armaments from the NATO allies that are not useful anymore to them, and that this money should be instead put for a social warfare. For example, there was one article where the journalists wrote about, that instead of buying pistols, we should buy vaccines instead. But it's 2 different lines in the budget, and it's 2 very different things. And the amounts of money are radically different. Second narrative is that Lithuanian military forces is weak, but at the same time, because of the purchases that are made from the Western states, such as, for example, Boxer infantry fighting vehicles that are brand new, is aggressive vis-a-vis Russia. Another exciting example of disinformation activities in the Baltic occurred during the current crisis in Ukraine. In Twitter, a relatively unpopular social network in Lithuania, a possible bot attack was spotted in the middle of January. Disinformation and cyber analyst Markian Kuzmovich said that about 40 fake profiles wrote around 2,000 messages to spread panic in the Baltic states. The profile pictures of the fake profiles are not of the real people, but are generated by machine learning software code that creates realistic looking images of people. All the fake profiles were created in January this year, and many of the shapes are not logical and are also automatically generated. They spread the messages that the Russian diplomats are leaving the Baltic states because of this, of the security matters, because of the danger that is being posed for Baltic states and also Estonian, Lithuanian, and Latvian population. The critical messages spread by those bots was the Kremlin. It was that, the main aim was to destabilize our societies, and at the same time to show, because Twitter is not particularly popular social network in the Baltic states, to show for Western states that that Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia is in a real danger somehow, and it's because of their own fault. Finally, I would like to present the trace posted by cyber warfare, and I think Lithuania is really doing a lot of job in this perspective field. In 2020, the Vice Minister of National Defense of Lithuania reported that some 150 cyber attacks targeted Lithuanian people, businesses, and national institutions daily. It's also being saw that very often during this certain security crisis, for example, intensification, if you create, it's also increases. It was also said that the cyber threats are closely connected with the security of the energy sector. Officials in Vilnius worry that when the country desynchronizes from the Moscow-controlled BREL energy network linking the Baltic states and Belarus with Russia, our national infrastructure, at the time connected with the Nordic and Western European states, might also come under cyber attack. At the latest developments in Ukraine show capabilities to defend critical physical and electronic infrastructure for the attacks is crucial. Lithuania is standing firmly to boost its cyber capabilities. National Cybersecurity Center in Kaunas, Lithuania's second largest city, can see the attacks unfold in the real time. And it's also all the time seeing those attacks, creating algorithms to find them, to identify them, and to warn the people about it. Also, it's being seen that changes in our everyday lives and rapidly changing technologies also call for a constant evolution in how we perceive cyber threats and counter them. Cyber espionage groups coordinated by Russian intelligence service pose a significant threat to Lithuanian institutions. According to the Lithuanian National Threat Assessment made in 2021, the cyber capabilities of Russia and other hostile countries likely to become the primary tool for information gathering due to the changes caused by the pandemic and our lifestyle. So to sum up, because I don't really want to take a lot of time, the hybrid challenges faced by the Baltic states are somehow universal and unique at the same time. Being in the very center of tensions at the NATO eastern flank, Baltic states are often the first to encounter many of the different hybrid threats. We have a lot of know-how to offer. Yet the rapidly changing security environment in Europe, new technologies and new trends require us to update our knowledge, foresee new threats, create practical tools for deterrence, and be ready to defend ourselves and our allies not only with soldiers, tanks, and bullets, but also with honest and sincere news, well-trained programmers, or with security-focused energy policy decisions. To this, I would like to share my two personal recommendations I believe would contribute to the security of the Baltic states and all the other NATO allies, including Greece. NATO Centers of Excellence, in my opinion, is a suitable tool to strengthen the alliance's capabilities in many different fields of warfare. Having theoretical analysis connected with the practice is the best way to improve. Yet the critical problem is that other centers of excellence have a very different contingent of participating states. NATO and its member states should look for a more efficient and at the same time more stimulating system to expand the capabilities of the centers of excellence, as well as to encourage the member states to become contributing participants of as many centers as possible. As the migration crisis in the Eastern Europe proved, we cannot know what challenges and when will hit us in the current world. Also, regional cooperation with the different like-minded partners inside and outside the NATO should be encouraged even more. It is well known that it's nearly impossible to name all the possible hybrid threats that might occur essential to NATO now or later. looking for new state-private cooperation tools with the persons or entities in like-minded countries such as Australia, South Korea, Japan, and etc., is essential to be better prepared for challenges such as secure trading routes or other in more and more global world. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for organizing this event.
Thank you very much, Mr. Justin. Before going to the to the last speaker, I would like very shortly to go to a couple of questions that we have it for Professor Artur Kruczak and for Justina Kulis. The first question is for the last two speakers on Poland and Lithuania. One of the characteristics of the Russian hybrid attack propaganda is to say ethnic Russians in this region of the Ukraine as if these are calling for Russian assistance. Number one, how many so-called ethnic Russian are there in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia? And number two, what measures are these states taking to integrate them, and are they determined not to integrate but remain foreigners enabling Russia propaganda? This is one question. And the second one is, I have one question to ask Professor Artur. If give a short time, only 1 minute, my question about China, NATO, and present situation which we are discussing. And the last one is about the implication of EU, of European Union, NATO relationship to Professor Artur Kruczak. So two questions for Artur Kruczak plus one, for Dr. Justin Kulis. Who's going to take the floor? Professor Artur Kruczak, you would like to go on, and then Dr. Justin Kulis, go ahead.
Oh, right. Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions. Just answering them one by one. Well, when it comes to Russians in Poland, actually there are no, say, Russian ethnic groups or Russian settlements or Russian who settled in Poland. In contrast to Ukrainians or Germans. It's not like, the threat of a fifth column or something like that. However, there are many Russians working, living, studying in Poland. There are many Russian companies, so we can say that their presence is somehow dispersed, but it's hardly comparable to looking at them as in a similar way as ethnic communities in the Baltic countries or in Ukraine. Second question, how about China and China's?
Yes, China and NATO. Yeah, NATO and China, and actually, I think that China is quite fond of observing what's been developing now in Europe. Well, with one important remark or disclaimer, for China, NATO is, say, secondary to the United States. NATO is actually a vehicle for the US power. So China is seeing these developments in Europe as a real challenge, say daunting challenge for the United States. And of course, how or what consequences could it have for the situation in East Asia, in the Asia Pacific, or for global competition, so to say. And we know that it might entail some consequences in economy. Definitely, the economy will suffer quite a lot of high prices for energy
resources and instability on the markets, but also for let's say geostrategic balancing in Asia Pacific. So so I think that well, for now, China benefits greatly from this situation, from these developments. And then the European Union, well, the EU, well, we know that the EU has this normative power, and probably it will use this normative power in terms of adopting declarations, common let's say conclusions of the European Council, etc. Maybe some small sanctions, but well, the real problem is the economic interdependence with Russia as a reservoir for raw materials and some other, let's say, resources necessary for the economic development, for the production. So I think that I wouldn't expect a very say strong reply on the part of the European Union, but okay, let's see how the EU leaders and ministers would react to these developments.
Thank you, Mr. Professor Arthur. Because the time is limited, we give the floor now to Dr. Justina Koulis before they will go to the last speaker. Mr. Koulis, the floor is yours.
Yes, I will be very, very short, I think, because yes, there are really a big Russian minorities in Latvia and Estonia. It's about a quarter of the population of both countries. In Lithuania, it's about 5%. It's the second biggest national minority in Lithuania. The biggest one is Polish. But I think I cannot really speak about, you know, the integration policies of national minorities of Latvia and Estonia. I'm not an expert in that, but I can see that in Lithuania, we are really happy to live in the multi-ethnical community, in the multi-ethnical society. One of the most respected theaters, for example, in Vilnius is the Russian Drama Theater. And I think it's really, there are a lot of, there are some mistakes probably did by Lithuanian government and Lithuanian society. We still have, I think there are some tools we can still use to better integrate our national minorities. But I think in general, we are really doing a good job in creating a better opportunities for studying in schools, in the universities, at the same time as integrating in the society and creating a really good, for example, local policies where you can use, you know, the second, where in the regions where the national minorities makes a certain percent of citizens. It's also, you know, it's compulsory for the state institutions to use the secondary language. For example, in Vilnius region, the Polish language is secondary in most of the state institutions. So I think it's also a good sign that we are really trying to integrate our national minorities, and we are very happy to have them, because I think it's much better to live in a society, in the multi-ethnical society, rather than, you know, to live alone.
Okay, and very shortly, we have a question from Jan, who is asking Professor Kruczek, Arthur Kruczek here. What is the risk, in your opinion, Professor Kruczek, that the other autocratic regime in the world will be attracted to solve the dreams by military tools? Professor Arthur Kruczek? Maybe he's not there, or he just, okay.
No, I'm here, but I couldn't.
Okay, let me ask the question. What is the risk, in your opinion, that the other autocratic regime in the world will be attracted to solve their dreams by military tools?
Yeah, well, that's Yeah, I would say that there are many risks which are associated with the situation now in Ukraine and its possible consequences. But we know that the EU doesn't have its army. We know that the EU is a crisis management organization, and all the missions of the operations were serving, let's say, I'll say auxiliary tasks, especially after military conflicts, such as in the Balkans, especially in Bosnia, the Athens mission, or in well, there are some civilian support missions, or some bridge missions, etc. So I wouldn't count upon the EU as a military actor. Quite to the contrary, the EU is a great economic power. So only economic tools, financial tools, and some measures that will be based on the EU as a common market, as economic monetary union, might be somehow effective, but only to some extent, and they would not be probably decisive in preventing from some further steps by Russia.
Thank you, Professor Arthur Grusz. So now we have to go to the last speaker. Thank you very much for your patience, Dr. Christol Nies-Ripor. Apologies for the misspelling. I was very close enough, I think. Well, our young scholars from Poland. You know, he's coming from the Center for Eastern Studies, Poland. He's an analyst of Ukrainian affairs. He's going to talk about today, you know, one of the most interesting issues we have today, Ukrainian between Russia and the West. Sir, please unmute and take the floor. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It was one of the most perfect pronunciation of my surname, so thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And thank you for invitation and to allow me to present my point of view on Ukrainian issue. The topic of my speech is, as you have already said, Ukraine between Russia and the West. And today, as we are now observing events in Ukraine, this line between Western civilization and so-called Ruski Mir, the Russian world, is in fact the front of the armed conflict. So this makes this division even more significant, and my speech as well. So I feel full responsibility to be clear as possible. At least I will try. So I think that I will not exaggerate if I define that what we are seeing today is a dramatic emanation of Vladimir Putin's obsession, a paranoia of a man who cannot deal with reality which is increasingly growing distance between Russia and Ukraine, distance caused by the pro-European choice of Ukraine nation. This reality arose as a frustration of the Russian leader, frustration which found its summary in a speech that we have already heard a few days ago, this full of contempt statement about the Nazi regime in Ukraine, the external control of the authorities in Kiev, and the Soviet origin of the present borders of Ukraine is I think, the topic no longer for a political scientist or a politologist or even a historian, but for a psychotherapist. And my only regret is that Putin, while trying to explain his views by referring to the specifically understood historical justice, doesn't show his objectivity, because it would require him to undermine the fact that Kaliningrad, for example, belongs to Russia, which according to his logic should also be reconsidered. It's as illegal and historical issues. However, it makes no sense to try and argue with all these theses. More important, Today's invasion of Russian troops is actually an act of Russia admitting its defeat on the act of, and this is in fact the act of frustration of the Russian elite. The Kremlin, after 8 years of the peace process within Minsk agreements, has admitted its own failure. Sophisticated Kremlin plan to force Kiev to federalize the Ukrainian state, to recognize the autonomy of Donbas, and guarantee this fact in the Ukrainian constitution, were admitted in Moscow to have no chance of being implemented. Over the 7 years, Russia has tried to use the Minsk agreements to undermine the Ukrainian independence and sovereignty by granting Donbas the greatest possible autonomy, which would effectively block any efforts by Kiev to integrate with Western structures. So from this point of view, the armed attack is a new form of Russian mean to force Ukrainian authorities, also through pressure from the West, frightened by the threat of war in Europe, to make significant concessions, undermining Ukrainians' hope for integration with EU and NATO. But the most important fact, I think, is Russia's failure inside the Ukraine. The Kremlin has lost its illusions about a favorable political change, I would say, in Ukrainian government. President Zelensky, while, and this is the most interesting, he was initially perceived by Moscow as an incompetent and inexperienced politician who could be easily manipulated, proved that he is immune to Russian influence and blackmail. Moreover, Zelensky took a number of steps which Kremlin treated as a challenge. For example, he sanctioned pro-Russian politician in Ukraine. He banned the broadcasting of Russian TV. He activated international activities aimed at resolving the conflict in Donbas. He finally took the initiative, the so-called Crimean platform, which initiating an international debate on the need to deoccupy Crimea Peninsula. So moreover, anti-Russian and pro-European sentiments in Ukraine are constantly growing, depriving the Kremlin illusions about the democratic change of government in its favor. Each year, Ukraine is moving farther and farther away from the Russian spheres of influence. Hence, the Kremlin decided to de facto withdraw from the Minsk agreement and to abandon this form of negotiation with the West and Ukraine. As we can saw, this not bring the results expected by Moscow. Russia has failed to subjugate Ukraine, and Ukraine is unambiguously declaring the Euro-Atlantic aspiration. And this is confirmed by the recent public opinion polls showing that over 60% of Ukrainians want to join NATO, and over 75% want to join the European Union. In his morning speech today, Putin called the target of military operation the denazification and disarmament of all Ukraine. This suggests a determination to change the government in Kiev, which will not be possible without the complete subordination of Ukraine. At present, I'm speaking honestly, I'm convinced that the scope of land operation will be limited to Donbas, together with air and missile strike in the whole country in order to defeat Ukrainian army and to take over both eastern oblasts at the eastern part of Ukraine. And it will have an impact on the internal situation in Ukraine. It can be expected that Ukrainian society will be eager to take back the territories occupied by separatists, and this will put Ukrainian authorities in a very difficult situation. Putin hopes that Ukrainians or Ukrainian society will turn against Zelensky, who has promised to settle the conflict in Donbas. So in this scenario, Zelensky not only didn't bring peace, but also took part took part in the division of Ukraine. He lost part of his country. So at the same time, it will make it possible to present Ukrainians as irresponsible nation and put pressure on Western countries, to put pressure on Ukraine to make concessions in order to bring peace. in the terms of in the Russian terms, of course. So Russia will try to convince Western countries that recognizing the separatist republics and taking over the territory of the rest of the Donbass, it is not a war. It is not an invasion. It is only a repulsion of Ukrainian troops allegedly threatening the security of the inhabitants of the self-proclaimed republics. Moscow hopes that there will be disagreements inside Europe as to how to interpreting the Moscow behavior and whether to impose sanction or whether not. So the discussion will start over the few next days. Of course, there is also a risk of a full-scale conflict when Putin decides that there is no other than military way to fully subjugate Ukraine. However, this will be the beginning of the end of his regime, in my opinion, because it is beyond the strength of the Russian army to take control of the entire territory of the Ukrainian state and to exercise effective control over it. So the only problem is that I'm not sure whether Putin realizes. So just to make a short summary, Kremlin may decide to take military actions as the only solution, and it will therefore be a kind of act of desperation by Russia that is losing its influence and illusions about a favorable political change in Ukraine. However, the intervention will only consolidate Ukrainian society and stimulate even greater anti-Russian sentiment. For this reason, reversing this trend of westernizing Ukraine by military invasion, this is an idea that may have the opposite effect to the intended one, but perhaps the only one that remains for Moscow in the perception of the Russian political elite. Thank you very much. If you have time for some question, I'll be very happy to answer.
Thank you very much. We have one question directly to you, sir. Very briefly, one Greek scholar asked, are sanctions against the Lukashenko regime in Belarus effective? Are sanctions going to be effective against Putin regime today?
I'm not an expert about Belarusian issues, but what can I say about Russia and the effectiveness of sanctions against Putin's regime? Putin will go as far as we allow him. The reaction of the West should be decisive and strong. Otherwise, in my opinion, the existence of the Ukrainian state will be endangered. So everything is in our hands.
Okay, thank you very much. All of the great presentation and the great speakers, and we are on time. Allow me now to say a few words about the Greek perspective, and then I'm going to summarize the presentation of the speakers. All right, now regarding Greece, very shortly, as you realize, as you know, Greece is a member of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and European Union. Therefore, the Greek government will support both institutions wherever they decide to impose measure or sanction on the Russian Federation. All right. Now, in order to make a little bit out of the box critical thinking and to be a little bit provocative in a very kind way, I would like to ask myself in addressing you. Does Putin create a distraction, focusing his opponent on it while he pursues his real goal, which were the declaration of Donetsk and Luhansk region? This is one question that I would like to ask you as part of my presentation. Is possible that Putin knew that West would not back down and impose sanctions while he was threatening Ukraine? Allow me now to say, because any external operation is always connected to a domestic issue. And I would probably say to you, related to the domestic conception in the Russian Foundation, the COVID economy in Russia has many troubles, and Putin is a distraction. Another one, an external distraction and a domestic distraction. to keep the Russia focused on something else. A threat to the motherland, to Russian Federation, always seems to work for getting patriotic Russian behind the government while forgetting about financial crisis and loss of even more freedom. And what about the Ukrainian crisis that Mr. Chrysol explained quite well? Is likely contributing to higher world oil and natural gas prices, to the great benefits of Putin's energy-based economy and to the benefits of the Russian people. Well, on this time, the winter that we have it brought a lot of high prices, would go a long way to get the Russian economy back on the right track. So we have it external destruction and domestic destruction, as we can see. Now, one of the major, player in Europe, of course, is Germany. Well, Germany is a member of NATO, like Poland, like Greece, like the Baltic States, Lithuania, and the EU member too, and European Union member, but has immense economic interest jointly with the Russian Federation, like Dmitry Grim said that. Now, besides that, we all realize that Putin is trying to play the domestic games, RIEAS versus, the external, external operation that does today in Ukraine. But allow me to say now something that might seem a little oxymoron to you, but I will possibly share with you. I do believe that to some extent, what happened today in Ukraine might come after the Chinese Olympic game to Taiwan, all right? And to some extent, Russians and the Chinese, diplomats have thought about that, and they would not be surprised if we see another Ukrainian crisis related to China in Taiwan. Today, the war focused on the Ukraine and Russia, but is China thinking seriously to make a move on Taiwan after the Olympic Games is completed in China? Are Putin, the Chinese president, may have made such a deal? Well, like I said, it seems like oxymoron, but what happened today in Russia might see in the South Chinese Sea in Taiwan. And this is going to create, a global issue. Is the United States ready to deal with the Ukrainian crisis today and tomorrow with another crisis from China against Taiwan? Now, this is a hypothetical scenario, but I would not be surprised if we see something like that. And another hypothetical scenario is how come, Mediterranean and the Balkan state would not be affected by the side effect of the Ukrainian crisis. I'm sure that something will happen in the Southern Chinese Sea in the coming months after, the dust goes down in the Ukrainian crisis. In other words, NATO and the West and the United States must be ready for the spillover effect of the Ukrainian crisis to the Indo-Pacific, to the Balkans, and to the Eastern Mediterranean. This is something that I want to share with you, because right now, Mr. Putin opened a door for many unpredictable issues. And when we talk about violation of the international law, how this is going to stop? Do we have anarchy? Of course we do. Are we going to control anarchy? Nobody knows. But how we are moving today in the Baltic state, in the Black Sea, in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Indo-Pacific, it seems to me that, this kind of confusion and division in our world today is going to increase instead of shrinking. So some of this thought I want to share with you. As you realize, I do not have the answer. I do not have the answer, but I would like, as a critical thinker analyst, to avoid a little bit the conventional way and to see the consequences of the crisis that we have today in the Central Eastern Europe. Because we realize whatever happened to Poland today, or to Lithuania and to the Baltic state, might become, as a new episode, as a new crisis in China against Taiwan, in Bosnia, Herzegovina, in who knows? Like I said, nobody has the answer. Only the God can decide it. Only the God knows what's going on, except us. So, but we need to make hypothetical scenario because, a new world order is like, coming to the war today. And one more comment that I would like to share with you is that, Russia is fundamentally dissatisfied with the post-Cold War order and the loss of the status as the superpower. Mr. Vladimir Putin never realized the collapse of the Soviet Union. He said it was the biggest mistake. He has some kind of, how can I say, like a cycle, how to make Russia a big country, not like a Soviet Union, but he realized that it was a big mistake. And of course, West may have been content with a fragile status on the Eastern flank. Central and Eastern Europe is a very important organ of the diplomatic history. Whatever happened in this area, might have, some kind of pneumonia or flu to the diplomatic community in Southeast Asia. All right, that's all I want to say. In this difficult time we are living today, the only thing we can do just to make some hypothetical scenario and try to understand try to understand the psychosynthesis of the leader who is coming from the intelligence service, because Mr. Vladimir Putin is coming from KGB, and so he realized that he's a man who always know how to play a chess and a poker at the same time. All right, I better stop here, and because the time is 6:04, I don't want to go beyond the time that we have already set. But allow me now very briefly to go over, the summaries of the speakers. All right. The first speaker was Mr. Dimitris Grime from the United States. Well, he elaborated that broad understanding of lesson learning and consequences of past war has rendered direct open conflict between major world powers and nation states are no longer worth the cost. As we are witnessing now in the response to Russian aggression in Ukraine, there is a lack of desire for the types of great power conflict that defines the first half of the 20th century. The global economy, economic interdependence, potential use of nuclear and biological weapons, and the lack of will from the general public have created the ideal condition for nations to conduct operations other than war in order to achieve their desired objective. Our second distinguished scholar, Professor Arthur Grusak from Krakow, Jagiellonian University, was focuses on several important issues. Number one, the delusion of global security, the continuous downsliding of the liberal international order in the 21st century. Number two, divergent national view within NATO from a brain dead organization to an even stronger alliance. Number three, the next strategic concept report NATO 2030, united for a new era. Number four, the burden of USA global security. China as the biggest challenge, the shift of the center of gravity from the North Atlantic area to the Indo-Pacific region, including, of course, the strategic, countries, India, the questionable deterrent, military, political, cyber, and the humanitarian challenge. And go on, our distinguished scholars from Lithuania, Dr. Justina Kulis, just pointing out that the hybrid challenge faced by the Baltic states are somehow universal and unique at the same time. Be in the very center of tension in the NATO eastern flank, Baltic states are often the first to encounter many of the different hybrid threats. We have a lot of know-how to offer. Yet the rapidly changing security environment in Europe, new technologies and new trends require us to update our knowledge, foresee new threats, create practical tools for deterrence, and be ready to defend ourselves and allies not only with soldiers, tanks, and bullets, but also with an honest and sincere news, world training program, or security-focused energy policy decision. And he concludes by saying that this will be demonstrated by covering 4 different kinds of hybrid threats in energy security, disinformation, investment into the critical infrastructure, quite important, and cyber attacks, and sharing the good Lithuanian experiences as a part of the Baltic states of coping with these vulnerabilities. So, and of course, I would pass now for a few minutes because the time is 6:08. We can be a little bit late. I will pass, the floor shortly to our distinguished scholar from Poland, Mr. Kruczol Nikropit, to make a little, a just telegraphic summary of your speech because I don't have a part of your summary, sir. If you can say just 2-3 words to summarize, the great analysis you made, what you probably say?
I'm sorry, I will take a chance and to use my time to make a short explanation for the question that was asked by one of the participants, the explanation for Putin's action. And the explanation is that the pro-European course chosen by Kiev is considered as dangerous for Russian authorities. Establishment of the democratic system in Ukraine, where the society freely and fairly choose their authorities, is considered as a bad example for Russian society that could claim similar rights. This may undermine the position, the authority, the position, and the most of all, the ability to benefit from access to financial resources by Kremlin elite. So this is the reason why democratic reform and a pro-Western course of Ukraine are unacceptable for Moscow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, since the time is 6, so 10 minutes after 6, I would like to give, the floor to Ambassador Artur Lompart from the Embassy of Poland, and then to Lady Ruta Valsiunene from the Lithuanian Embassy to close this quite important and productive and efficient webinar. And on behalf of RIEAS, I want to thank all of you for finding the time to be here. And of course, I want to thank from my heart the embassies of Poland and the Embassy of Lithuania in Athens for collaborating with the Research Institute for European American Studies and to update everyone globally about the critical issues that we are living today in the Central and Eastern Europe. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you very much, Professor, for organizing this webinar and for the speakers for wonderful speeches. I can see from the chat that there are a lot of questions and a lot of answers, and still we have time to try to find new questions and new answers in the future, because as we can see, the aggression just started. So we still have not too many factors for to create the answers. But thank you very much for this wonderful webinar, and I hope that it's not the last one. And we will be back within some time to check how the situation has changed and how our opinions concerning this Russian crisis, not Ukrainian crisis. That's the very important definition we should use in our discussions, because it's a Russian crisis, which we can observe from 2008 when Russia attacked Georgia and then Ukraine. So thank you very much, and wonderful for the wonderful webinar. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Mrs. Ruta, please take the floor.
Yes, so my most sincere gratitude to everyone who participated today and to the co-organizers, Professor Nomikos and the Polish Embassy. It is a very symbolic day, the darkest day for Ukraine, for whole Europe and the world, I would say. And it's very symbolic that we talk about the issues and the threats today. And we should be all aware of the challenges, of the threats, and we should, I agree here with our Polish ambassador, that it should not be the last time we talk about it here in Athens as well. So thanks everyone, and I wish you a safe evening as possible.
Thank you, Mrs. Ruta. I'm going to have the video tonight. I will pass the video to the embassies, Poland and Lithuania. And in 48 hours, we are going to upload the video at RIEAS website, so everybody can have access to that. Because some people, wanted to attend it, but they didn't have the time, or they go out. But before I conclude this, this great event, I want to thank everyone, especially from Europe, from the United States, because I see people from India, and I see people from Taiwan, from Taipei, which I know personally. So I'm very happy that Dr. Glenn Siegel, from Israel, always, I know he's very busy, but always find the time to be with us. And, Dr. Yaropoulos, everyone, Dr. Panouchos, and of course, one of my best friends for, in here in Greece, Jan, the military attaché in Poland, and the ambassador. And I always, I think it's a good idea to keep in touch, to stay in touch. And maybe, like the ambassador said, we need to see how the situation is going on, and we might repeat, a similar event, depending on how the situation is going to be. Because what happened, like I said, what happened today in Poland is a flu, but the pneumonia is going on to different parts of the world. So let's see what's going on. But I see, the Mr. Crystal has raised your hand. You want to say something, said, or is just your head is forgotten there? You raise, and you want to say something before we go? No, okay, I'm sorry. So thank you, everyone, from my heart. I think we learned something. We don't have the answer on this question, but at least collectively, as a team, we might think better than one individual. Collectively is much better than unilaterally. Something that NATO we have to, support. We have to support, the European Union. We have to support all the leaders, to find a solution to the crisis in Central and Eastern Europe. Because, like I said before, we don't want the flu to become pneumonia, or to have a global geopolitical and democratic virus. Thank you very much, all of you. Have a good night, and I hope to see you in another event. Thank you. Bye-bye. Stop it. Thank you.